Ripe! The sound was sharp and violent, cutting through the serene silence of the Emerald Lake pines. Sergeant Bulldog Bronson didn't just tear the document, he shredded it. The yellow building permits tamped, notarized, and entirely legal fluttered down onto the gravel driveway like dead leaves. Alana Sterling stood perfectly still, her hands loose at her sides. She watched the paper fall, her expression unreadable. Bronson stepped closer, invading her personal space. He was a wall of muscle and bad attitude, smelling of chewing tobacco and sweat. He worked his jaw, gathering saliva, and then, with a casual, disgusting sound, he spat a wad of pink gum directly onto the toe of Alana's hiking boot. "You think holding this piece of trash makes you a homeowner?" Bronson sneered, his voice dripping with venom. He pointed a thick finger in her face. "Let me tell you how it works here. People like you only come to Emerald Lake to scrub floors or steal silver. You don't own mansions." Before Alana could speak, Bronson lunged. He grabbed her by the back of her neck and slammed her face first onto the hood of his patrol car. Clang! The metal was searing hot under the midday sun. Alana hissed as her cheek burned against the paint. "Stop resisting!" Bronson roared for the benefit of the audience, though she hadn't moved a muscle. He wrenched her arms behind her back, ratcheting the handcuffs so tight they cut off her circulation. Around them, the residents of Emerald Lake slowed their golf carts and luxury SUVs. Men in polo shirts and women in tennis whites stared. They didn't look horrified. They looked annoyed that the help was causing a scene. They looked at Alana with pure, unfiltered contempt. Alana lay pinned against the hot metal, the gum still stuck to her shoe, the taste of dust in her mouth. But she didn't cry. She closed her eyes, and a terrifyingly cold calculation began to tick behind her eyelids. Flash forward, 3 weeks later. The heavy oak doors of the federal district court swung open with a groan that sounded like doom. The courtroom was packed. The air was freezing cold. Standing at the defendant's table was Sergeant Bronson. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was wearing a cheap suit that was too tight in the shoulders, and he was trembling. His face was pale, slick with sweat. He looked small. "All rise," the bailiff boomed. Bronson looked up. His eyes traveled up the high mahogany bench, past the Great Seal of the United States, to the figure seated at the top. She was wearing a black robe that swallowed the light. Her face was stern, majestic, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the woman he had slammed onto the hood of a car. The Honorable Alana Sterling, Circuit Judge of the United States Court of Appeals, looked down at him. She held a heavy wooden gavel in her hand. She didn't say a word. She just stared at him, and in her eyes, Bronson saw the end of his life. He thought he had just caught a mouse in his garden. He didn't know he had just unlocked the tiger's cage. Emerald Lake did not welcome strangers. It tolerated them, and only barely. Tucked away in the dense, rain-shadowed forests of the Pacific Northwest, the town was a geological jewel, a basin of water so startlingly green it looked like liquid jade, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that stood like sentinels against the sky. The air here was thin, crisp, and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It was a place of profound silence, the kind that money buys to drown out the noise of a dying world. Alana Sterling loved the silence, even if she knew she didn't truly belong to the demographic that owned it. She steered her 1998 Volvo station wagon up the winding gravel drive. The car was a tank-faded beige paint, a ticking engine, and 300,000 miles on the odometer. It was the antithesis of the sleek Teslas and Range Rovers that populated the driveways of Emerald Lake. It was practical, unpretentious, and resilient, much like Alana herself. She parked in front of the Blackwood Estate. It was a Victorian-era mansion that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the garden was a riot of overgrown blackberries. But to Alana, it wasn't a ruin. It was a sanctuary. After 30 years on the bench, Presiding over the most complex and soul-crushing cases in the Ninth Circuit, she needed a project that didn't involve sentencing men to die or dissecting constitutional crises. She needed wood, nails, and solitude. Alana stepped out of the car. At 58, she moved with a deliberate economic grace. She wasn't wearing her judicial robes today. She was dressed in stiff, dark denim jeans, a thick cable-knit turtleneck sweater the color of oatmeal, and heavy work boots. Her hair, usually coiffed into a severe bob for the courtroom, was pulled back into a messy ponytail, strands of gray escaping to frame a face free of makeup. She took a deep breath, letting the cold mountain air fill her lungs. It stung, but it felt clean. She walked to the trunk and retrieved a heavy metal tape measure and a clipboard. She was planning to replace the perimeter fence knot to keep people out, but to define her space, to mark a boundary where the chaos of her professional life couldn't reach her. She walked to the edge of the property, where the ancient iron fence had rusted away. She knelt in the damp grass, extending the tape measure. The metal strip made a sharp zip-zip sound in the quiet afternoon. For a moment, Alana allowed herself to relax. The weight of the gavel, the weight of judgment, lifted. Here, she was just Alana, a woman with a house, a woman with a future that involved reading by a fireplace and watching the mist roll off the lake. She didn't hear the patrol car approach. The modern interceptors were designed to be silent predators. She only realized she was no longer alone when a shadow fell across her hands, blocking the weak afternoon sun. The vehicle was a Dodge Charger, painted a matte, aggressive gray with Emerald Lake Police stenciled in reflective black letters on the side. It idled at the end of her driveway, the engine purring with a low, menacing rumble. It didn't look like a tool of public safety. It looked like a weapon of war. Two doors opened simultaneously. The driver was a mountain of a man, Sergeant Bulldog Bronson. He lived up to the nickname. He had no neck, just a thick slope of muscle connecting his jaw to his shoulders. His uniform was stretched to the limit, and his face was a slab of red meat, dominated by a thick, bristly mustache. He chewed on something tobacco, or gum, working his jaw with a slow bovine rhythm. The passenger was younger, skinnier, Officer Kyle. He looked like a high school quarterback who had peaked at 17 and was now trying to find an identity in a uniform that didn't quite fit. He adjusted his belt nervously, his hand hovering near his taser. Alana stood up slowly. She didn't drop her tape measure. She didn't raise her hands. She simply straightened her spine and waited. Bronson didn't walk. He stomped. He marched up the driveway, crushing the gravel under his boots, asserting ownership of the ground with every step. He stopped 5 feet from Alana, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at the old Volvo, then at the peeling paint of the mansion, and finally, with a sneer of absolute disgust, at Alana. "Help's supposed to use the service entrance," Bronson grunted. His voice was gravelly and wet. Alana blinked. "Excuse me?" "The service entrance," Bronson repeated, louder this time, as if speaking to someone slow or deaf. He pointed a thick finger toward the back of the property. "If you're here to clean or fix the pipes or whatever it is you people do, you park that piece of junk round back. We don't like eyesores on the main road." "I am not help," Alana said. Her voice was calm, modulated to the perfect pitch of courtroom authority. "And I am not here to clean." Bronson laughed. It was a short, sharp bark. "Right. And I'm the Queen of England. Listen, lady, I know the owners of this place, the Blackwoods. They haven't been here in 10 years. "That is correct," Alana said. "The Blackwoods sold the property 2 months ago." "Sold it?" Bronson narrowed his eyes. "To who? We didn't get no notification." "To me," Alana said simply. Silence stretched between them. Bronson stared at her. He looked at her work boots, her natural hair, her dark skin. He tried to compute the data. Black woman plus old car. homeowner of a historic estate. The equation returned an error in his mind. Bull! Bronson spat. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. You're a squatter. Or a thief. We've had reports of copper wire going missing from renovation sites. I bet if I pop the trunk of that rust bucket, I'm going to find spools of wire and maybe some silverware. You will find a spare tire and a bag of potting soil, Alana replied, her gaze hardening. Officer, I suggest you step back. You are trespassing on private property. Trespassing? Bronson looked at Kyle, grinning incredulously. You hear that, Kyle? The thief is telling us we're trespassing. Kyle shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. Sarge, maybe we should check the dispatch logs. See if there's a deed transfer. Shut up, Kyle, Bronson snapped without looking back. He focused his malice entirely on Alana. I don't need a log to know a scam when I see one. You think you can just waltz into Emerald Lake, pick an empty house, and play pretend? Not on my watch. He unclipped the thumb brake on his holster. He didn't draw the weapon, but the threat was explicit. I want to see ID, Bronson demanded. And I want to see a work order. If you don't have a work order proving you were hired to be here, you're going downtown for burglary. I do not have a work order, Alana said, reaching for the clipboard she had placed on the hood of her Volvo. Because I am the owner. I have the deed of sale and the building permit for the fence. She picked up the yellow document, bearing the official seal of the county clerk. Here, she said, extending it toward him. This is a legal document. Bronson snatched the paper from her hand. He didn't read it. He just held it up, looking at it with contempt, as if it were a dirty tissue. Papers, he mocked. Anyone can print papers. I got a printer at home. Can make myself the Pope if I want. Alana watched him, her internal alarm bells ringing. This wasn't standard police work. This was predation. Officer, Alana said, her voice dropping to a dangerous chill. That is a certified government document. If you look at the stamp, you will see the county clerk's seal. It matches the license plate on my vehicle, which is registered to this address. Bronson looked at her. He hated her voice. He hated that she wasn't scared. He hated that she used words like certified and registered with the ease of someone who owned them. You think you're smart, don't you? Bronson sneered. You think because you got some fancy fake ID and a printed piece of paper you can talk down to me? I am not talking down to you, Alana said. I am stating facts. Facts? Bronson laughed. Here's a fact. Rah-pee. He tore the building permit in half. Then he put the pieces together and tore them again. He opened his hand and let the yellow confetti rain down onto the gravel. Oops, Bronson said, his eyes glinting with malice. Looks like your legal document just expired. Alana stood frozen. The sheer audacity of the act momentarily stunned her. It was a destruction of public record. It was a felony committed in broad daylight by a man wearing a badge. That was official correspondence, Alana said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. You just committed a violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 2071, concealment, removal, or mutilation of records. Bronson's face turned a mottled purple. Don't you quote code at me, you bitch. You aren't a lawyer. You're a looter. I am not a looter, Alana said, stepping forward, her height seeming to increase as she drew herself up. And you are currently in violation of the Fourth Amendment. You have no probable cause. You have no warrant. You are harassing a citizen on her own land. I am ordering you to leave immediately. Ordering me? Bronson roared. He stepped right up to her, his chest bumping hers. He worked his jaw, gathering saliva, and then, with a wet, disgusting sound, he spat his chewing gum onto the toe of her boot. You order nobody, Bronson hissed. You are dirt. I am ordering you to leave immediately. Ordering me? Bronson roared. He stepped right up to her, his chest bumping hers. He worked his jaw, gathering saliva. And then, with a wet, disgusting sound, he spat his chewing gum onto the toe of her boot. "You order nobody," Bronson hissed. "You are dirt. You are here to scrub floors or spread your legs for the gardener. You don't own this." He gestured to the mansion. "This belongs to us, to the people who built this town, not to you." Alana looked down at the pink gum on her boot. Then she looked up at Bronson. Her eyes were no longer human. They were the cold, impartial lenses of the law itself. "You have made a grave error," Alana whispered. "Is that a threat?" Bronson shouted. "Kyle, did you hear that? She threatened an officer." Kyle, standing by the car, flinched. I didn't hear exactly." "She threatened to kill me." Bronson lied, his voice booming. "She's aggressive. She's resisting." He reached for his belt. "Hands!" he screamed. "That's it," Bronson growled. "You're going down." Bronson didn't use a standard takedown. He used a move designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. He grabbed Alana by the back of her sweater collar and her hair. He spun her around with violent force. "Get down!" He slammed her face first onto the hood of the Dodge Charger. Clang! The metal of the hood was searing hot from the engine and the sun. Alana cried out as her cheek burned against the paint. The impact knocked the wind out of her. Her glasses flew off, skidding across the hood and falling into the dirt. "Stop resisting!" Bronson roared, driving his knee into the back of her thigh to destabilize her. "I am not resisting," Alana gasped, her face pressed against the hot metal. Bronson grabbed her right arm and wrenched it behind her back. He pulled it up high, far past the natural range of motion. Pop! A sickening sound echoed from Alana's shoulder. A jolt of white-hot agony shot through her body. He had dislocated her shoulder. Alana bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a scream. Tears of pain leaked from her eyes, sizzling on the hot car hood. "Cuff her, Kyle! Get over here!" Kyle ran up, fumbling with his handcuffs. He looked terrified. "Sarge, I think her arm looks bad." "Cuff her!" Kyle snapped the cuffs onto her wrists. The metal bit into the bone. Alana turned her head to the side, her cheeks scraping the metal. She looked straight at Officer Kyle. She saw the square black box of the body camera clipped to the center of his chest. The green light was blinking. It was recording. Kyle saw her looking at it. Panic flickered in his eyes. He quickly raised his hand and covered the lens, pretending to adjust his uniform. "Covering the camera implies consciousness of guilt, officer," Alana whispered, her voice strained with pain. "Shut up!" Bronson grabbed her by the hair and yanked her upright. Just then, a bicycle bell rang. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, had stopped his bike at the end of the driveway. He lived next door. He was watching, his eyes wide with horror. "Why are you hurting that lady?" the boy cried out, his voice trembling. Bronson spun around. "Get out of here, kid! Go home! This is police business!" "She lives there!" the boy shouted, tears starting to fall. "She's the new neighbor. She gave me cookies." "I said beat it." Bronson took a step toward the child, hand on his taser. The boy turned his bike and fled, sobbing. Bronson turned back to Alana. "See what you did? You're disturbing the peace, traumatizing the community." He opened the back door of the cruiser. He didn't guide her in. He shoved her. Alana fell onto the hard plastic seat, landing awkwardly on her dislocated shoulder. A fresh wave of nausea washed over her. Bronson slammed the door shut. Alana lay across the back seat. The pain was blinding, but through the haze, her mind was already working. She was filing away the images, the spit, the torn paper, the covered camera, the crying child, the United States versus Sergeant Bronson. The car engine roared. As they pulled away from her sanctuary, Alana didn't look back at her house. She looked at the back of Bronson's head through the wire mesh. "He thinks he broke me," she thought, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "He has no idea that he just arrested the nightmare that is going to end him." The Emerald Lake Police Station was not a fortress. It was a clubhouse for boys with guns. Built from heavy timber and river rock, it sat nestled in the pines like a ski lodge, projecting an image of rustic authority. But as Bronson dragged Alana through the rear entrance, the illusion of civility vanished. The air inside was stale, recycled, and thick with the smell of floor wax, gun oil, and the sour, unwashed scent of fear. Alana stumbled as she was pulled from the cruiser. Her right arm hung uselessly at her side, a dead weight of throbbing agony. Her shoulder was swollen, the joint clearly distorted beneath her thick sweater. Every step sent a shockwave of nausea through her stomach. "Move it, Grandma," Bronson grunted, shoving her toward the booking desk. They paraded her through the bullpen. It was an open-plan office, filled with desks where officers leaned back in chairs, laughing and drinking coffee. As Bronson marched Alana through, the room fell silent. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. They didn't see a federal judge. They didn't see a 60-year-old woman in pain. They saw a trophy. "What you got there, Bulldog?" one officer called out, a man with a toothpick dancing in the corner of his mouth. "Another stray?" "Trespasser," Bronson announced loudly, playing to his audience. "Caught her trying to strip wire out of the Blackwood place. Claimed she owned it." A ripple of laughter went through the room. It was a cruel, exclusionary sound, the sound of a tribe closing ranks against an outsider. Alana kept her head high. She locked eyes with every man she passed, cataloging their faces. Badge 402, Badge 319, Badge 221. She memorized them all. At the far end of the room, the door to the chief's office stood open. Chief Dunlap was leaning against the doorframe, sipping from a mug that said, "All One Boss." He was a tall, skeletal man with skin like parchment and eyes that looked perpetually tired. He watched the procession with a bored detachment. He saw Alana's injury. He saw the way she was holding herself, the undeniable dignity beneath the dirt and dishevelment. For a second, his eyes met hers. Alana waited. She waited for the flicker of recognition, or perhaps the spark of procedural concern. Surely a chief of police knows you don't drag an injured senior citizen in handcuffs without a medical evaluation. But Dunlap did nothing. He didn't intervene. He didn't ask about her shoulder. He simply took a sip of coffee and turned back into his office, closing the door with a soft click. That click was the final verdict on the Emerald Lake Police Department. It wasn't just a few bad apples. The tree itself was rotten to the root. "Booking!" Bronson barked, spinning Alana around to face a camera mounted on the wall. "Smile for the scrapbook." He didn't uncuff her. He forced her face against the measuring chart. "Name? Alana Sterling. Address? The Blackwood Estate, 101 Lakeview Drive." Bronson sighed, shaking his head. "Still sticking to the lie, huh? Put her down as transient, Kyle." Kyle, standing behind the computer, hesitated. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Sarge, if she gives a name, we have to run it." "Run it then," Bronson snapped. "But mark the file, unverified. She probably stole the ID, too." Kyle typed her name. He hit enter. Alana watched him. She knew what was happening. Her file in the NCIC, National Crime Information Center, was flagged. Not as a criminal, but as a high-profile federal official. Accessing her full dossier required a clearance level that a small-town police deputy wouldn't possess. A prompt popped up on Kyle's screen. He frowned, squinting. "Sarge, it's giving me an error code. Restricted access, contact Department of Justice." Alana held her breath. This is it. The moment of realization. Bronson leaned over Kyle's shoulder. He stared at the screen for a second, then scoffed. "System's glitching again. Piece of junk. Just override it. Create a local file. Jane Doe if you have to. We aren't calling the DOJ over a squatter." Kyle bit his lip, but he did as he was told. He bypassed the federal warning. He created a local record for a Jane Doe, effectively erasing Alana Sterling from the digital world. "Personal effects," Bronson ordered. He ripped the watch from her wrist, a vintage Cartier tank watch. He took her belt. He demanded her boots. "You can keep the socks," he sneered. Standing in her stocking feet on the cold tile, holding her injured arm, Alana felt a strange sensation. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, crystalline focus. They had stripped her of her name, her property, and her digital footprint. They thought they were making her powerless. In reality, they were removing every single legal protection they had. By ignoring the NCIC warning, by creating a false file, they had just committed kidnapping. "Cell 3, Bronson said. "The one with the leak." The holding cell was a concrete box that smelled of mildew and despair. A steady drip, drip, drip echoed from a pipe in the ceiling, forming a slick puddle in the corner. There was no bed, just a steel bench bolted to the wall. Bronson shoved Alana inside and slammed the barred door. He didn't leave. He pulled a chair up to the other side of the bars, sitting backward on it like a high school coach having a heart-to-heart. Kyle stood nervously behind him, holding a clipboard. "All right," Bronson said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's get the story straight for the judge. Kyle, you writing this down?" "Yes, Sarge." "Time of incident, 12:30 p.m. Suspect was found trespassing on private property." Alana sat on the steel bench, closing her eyes. She focused on her breathing, compartmentalizing the pain in her shoulder. She treated the agony as background noise, a distraction to be ignored. "Upon approach," Bronson dictated, his voice loud and performative, "suspect became belligerent. She screamed profanities, racial slurs against officers." He paused, grinning at Alana through the bars. "You remember calling me a cracker, right?" Alana didn't open her eyes. She didn't respond. Her silence was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of his performance. "Write that down, Kyle. Racial slurs. And let's add, strong odor of intoxicants." "Yeah, she smelled like cheap gin. Probably been drinking all morning." Kyle's pen scratched against the paper. "Sarge, I didn't smell any alcohol." "You got a cold, Kyle," Bronson snapped. "I smelled it. Write it down." "Yes, Sarge." "Suspect then attempted to flee," Bronson continued, weaving his tapestry of lies. "When detained, she resisted violently. She swung at me, attempted to grab my taser." "That explains the shoulder," Bronson said to Alana, his voice dropping to a mock whisper. "You did that to yourself, you know, thrashing around like a wild animal. If you hadn't fought, you wouldn't be hurt." It was the classic abuser's logic. "Look what you made me do." So that's assault on an officer, resisting arrest, trespassing, burglary tools found in the vehicle. "The gardening trowel?" Kyle asked weakly. "It's a weapon if you hold it right," Bronson said. "Felony possession." He stood up, stretching his massive frame. He looked at Alana with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You know what this means, right? With no bail money and no local address, you're going to sit in this hole until the circuit judge comes around. That's next Tuesday. 5 days." He laughed. 5 days in this box? No shower, no phone, just you and the drip. You think you're tough? You think you're better than us? Let's see how high and mighty you act after you've been pissing in a metal toilet for a week." Alana finally opened her eyes. She looked at Bronson. Her gaze was not the look of a victim. It was the look of an anthropologist studying a particularly primitive species. She looked at the clipboard in Kyle's hand. She memorized the form number. She memorized the position of the pen. She looked at the clock on the wall, 2:15 p.m. "Are you finished?" she asked. Her voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly polite. Bronson blinked. He had expected screaming. He had expected begging. "Finished?" he sputtered. "I'm just getting started." "Good," Alana said, "because I want to make sure the record is complete." She closed her eyes again, dismissing him. Bronson turned red. He hated being ignored. He kicked the bars of the cell, a loud, jarring clang meant to make her flinch. Alana didn't move a muscle. "Let's go, Kyle," Bronson growled. "Let her rot. We'll see who's talking after a night in the cold." They walked away, their footsteps fading down the hall. Alana was left alone with the drip, the pain, and the cold, hard certainty of her revenge. Alana did not demand a lawyer. Not yet. To demand a lawyer now would be to trigger the system too early. A public defender in a town this corrupt would likely be a drinking buddy of the chief. They would cut a deal, or worse, they would tip off Bronson that she wasn't just a transient. If they knew who she was, if they really knew, they might panic. And panicked men do desperate things. They might make her disappear for real. No, safety lay in their ignorance. As long as they thought she was a nobody, they would be sloppy. They would be arrogant. Alana shifted her position on the bench, using her left hand to cradle her right elbow, supporting the weight of her dislocated arm. The pain was a dull, throbbing roar, but she pushed it into a mental box labeled later. She entered a meditative state, a technique she used during long, complex trials. She became a recording device. She listened. The acoustics of the jail were poor, but the vents carried sound. She heard conversations from the bullpen. "Hey, did you hear about the guy on Ridge Road? The one who wouldn't sell his land to the mayor?" "Yeah. Bronson pulled him over last night. DUI. Found a baggie of coke in the glove box." "Classic. The mayor's gonna have that deed by Friday." Alana filed this away. Case 1. Land seizure via planted evidence. "What about the girl, the waitress from the diner who filed the harassment complaint against Kyle?" "Chief paid her a visit. He told her that her little brother has an outstanding warrant in the next county. She dropped the complaint this morning." Case 2. Witness intimidation. Obstruction of justice. She heard names, she heard dates, she heard the casual, laughing confession of a department that functioned as a criminal enterprise. She built a mental dossier. She constructed the RICO case in her mind, connecting the dots between Bronson, the mayor, and the chief. She didn't need a pen. She had a mind honed by 30 years of legal precedent. She remembered everything. She sat in the lotus position on the cold steel, a monk in a dungeon, gathering the sins of Emerald Lake into her soul. At 5:12 p.m., the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Bronson. It was Chief Dunlap. He walked to the cell with a slow, leisurely gait. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing a fishing vest and a polo shirt, as if he had just come from a boat. He looked like a grandfather, kindly and harmless. He stopped at the bars and smiled. It was a warm, practiced smile. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I heard we had a bit of a misunderstanding today." He signaled to a guard down the hall who brought a chair. Dunlap sat down. "My name is Chief Dunlap. I'm the one who keeps the peace around here." Alana looked at him. This was the good cop routine. It was almost insulting in its transparency. "I looked at your file," Dunlap said, shaking his head sadly. "Transient, trespassing, assault on an officer. It's a heavy list." He leaned in. "Now, between you and me, Bronson can be a bit enthusiastic. He's a good man, protects this town like a dog, but he has a temper." He paused, waiting for Alana to agree, to bond with him over Bronson's brutality. She said nothing. "Here's what I'm thinking," Dunlap continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I don't want to ruin your life. You look like a nice lady who just got lost, maybe made a bad choice." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "This is a confession. Simple stuff. Disorderly conduct. You sign this, you pay a $500 fine, and I let you walk out of here right now. We forget the felony assault. We forget the whole thing." "And the condition?" Alana asked. "The condition," Dunlap smiled, "is that you get in that old Volvo of yours, you drive out of Emerald Lake, and you never, ever come back. You forget you ever saw this place." He held the paper through the bars. "It's a gift, ma'am. Freedom. Take it." Alana looked at the paper. Then she looked at Dunlap. She saw the rot behind his eyes. He wasn't offering mercy. He was offering exile. He was cleaning up a mess before it started to smell. She stood up. She walked to the bars. She looked him dead in the eye. "Chief Dunlap," she said. Her voice was low, resonant, and carried the weight of a gavel strike. "You have miscalculated. You think you are offering me a way out. But in reality, you are offering me evidence of coercion." Dunlap's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" "I will not sign your paper," Alana said. "I will not pay your fine. And I will not leave my home." She leaned closer, her face inches from his through the steel bars. "You have built a kingdom on silence and fear, Chief, but you just made the greatest judicial error in the history of this town. You didn't arrest a transient. You arrested the law itself." Dunlap stared at her. For a moment, a flicker of genuine unease crossed his face. She didn't sound like a transient. She sounded dangerous, but his arrogance won out. He snatched the paper back, his face twisted into a snarl. "Fine," he spat. "You want to play hardball? We can play." He stood up, kicking the chair away. "Guard," he shouted. "No phone calls for this one. No food, no water. Put her in the dark. Let's see how much she loves the law when she's thirsty." He turned to Alana one last time. "You had your chance. Now you belong to me." He stormed out. The lights in the cell block flickered and died, plunging Alana into absolute darkness. She sat back down on the bench. Her shoulder throbbed. Her throat was parched. But in the dark, Alana smiled. He took the bait, she thought. He just authorized a deprivation of rights. He just made it a federal case. She closed her eyes and began to wait. The night would be long, but the morning would be biblical. It was 2 a.m. in the Emerald Lake precinct. The clubhouse was quiet, save for the hum of the servers and the snoring of Sergeant Bronson, who was asleep in his office chair, boots up on the desk. At the dispatch console, dispatcher Sarah Miller, no relation to the corrupt officers, was working the graveyard shift. She was a quiet woman, 40 years old, who had worked for the department for a decade. She had seen everything, the bribes, the profiling, the cruelty. She kept her head down, raised her kids, and prayed for a transfer. But tonight, something was gnawing at her. She looked at the digital log for Jane Doe in cell 3. The file was incomplete. Kyle had marked it local ID only, bypassing the NCIC, National Crime Information Center scan. That's sloppy, Sarah thought, even for them. Curiosity, or perhaps a prick of conscience, drove her. She opened the file. She looked at the mugshot taken hours earlier. The woman looked disheveled, in pain, but her eyes, there was something about her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a vagrant. They were the eyes of someone who expected to be obeyed. Sarah did something forbidden. She reran the fingerprints that had been taken during booking. But this time, she didn't use the local bypass. She ran them through the IAFIS, Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, the FBI's database. The computer hummed. A progress bar loaded. Suddenly, a red alert box flashed on her screen. It wasn't a criminal record. It was a security warning. Access denied. Subject: Level 1, Federal Employee. Security: Clearance, Top Secret CC. Agency: United States Federal Judiciary, do not detain. Contact DOJ Office of the Inspector General immediately. Sarah froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the name associated with the prints, hidden behind the redaction bars but visible to a dispatcher with federal clearance codes. Sterling Alana, Circuit Judge, 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. Sarah put a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. They hadn't just arrested a civilian. They had arrested a federal judge. And not just any judge. Alana Sterling was known as the Iron Gavel. She was a legend. Sarah looked toward Bronson's office. He was sleeping, drool on his chin, completely unaware that he was holding a nuclear bomb in cell 3. If Sarah said nothing, the judge might disappear. Accidents happened in Emerald Lake cells. But if she spoke up to Bronson, he might bury her too. She needed an outside line. She pulled out her personal cell phone, shielding it under the desk. She opened an encrypted messaging app. She typed a name, Leo Chen. Leo was an independent journalist, a thorn in the side of the Emerald Lake elite. He was the only reporter who had ever tried to investigate the department. Sarah. Are you awake? Leo. I'm a journalist. I never sleep. What do you have, Sarah? Sarah. I can't talk, but you need to check the ownership records for 101 Lakeview Drive, the Blackwood Estate. Leo. Why? Sarah. Because the owner is currently sitting in cell 3 listed as a Jane Doe. And if my scan is right, she's a federal judge. Leo Chen sat in his cramped apartment in Seattle, surrounded by monitors. When he saw Sarah's message, he spilled his coffee. A federal judge? In Emerald Lake? It sounded insane. But in Emerald Lake, insanity was the currency of the realm. Leo began to dig. He accessed the county property tax records. They had been updated 2 weeks ago. The owner of 101 Lakeview Drive was listed as a blind trust, the Veritas Trust. Dead end? No. Leo traced the trust's registration. It led to a law firm in D.C. He searched the firm's partners. One of them was the former clerk for Justice Alana Sterling. He pulled up a photo of Judge Sterling. He zoomed in. Then he opened the police scanner archives he recorded 247. He found the dispatch audio from earlier that day. Trespasser, black female, 50s, aggressive. He matched the timeline. Then he did something bold. He drove to Emerald Lake. He didn't go to the station. He went to 101 Lakeview Drive. It was 4:30 a.m. The house was dark, silent. But in the driveway, illuminated by his headlights, sat an old beige Volvo station wagon. He ran the plates. Registered owner, Alana Sterling. And there, lying in the gravel driveway, shimmering in the dew, were tiny pieces of yellow paper. Confetti. Leo got out of his car. He knelt down. He picked up a piece. It had a partial stamp. Building Per. He looked a few feet away. There was a dark stain on the gravel. It looked like oil or wine or dried blood. Leo took a photo. He had the car. He had the property records. He had the source inside the station. He sat in his car and opened his laptop. He didn't wait for morning. He didn't wait for a comment from the chief. This was a story that couldn't wait. He typed the headline, "The Prisoner in Cell 3, How Emerald Lake Police Kidnapped a Federal Judge." He hit publish. Morning came to the Emerald Lake Police Station, not with sunlight, but with the ringing of phones. It started at 07:00 a.m. The front desk line lit up. Then the administrative line. Then the fax machine began to scream. Bronson walked out of his office, stretching, scratching his belly. "What is that racket? Sarah, answer the damn phones." Sarah looked up at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She had done her part. "I think you should answer this one, Sergeant," she said, holding up the red emergency line. "Who is it?" "It's the governor's office." Bronson froze. "The governor?" He grabbed the phone. "This is Sergeant Bronson." He didn't get to say another word. He just listened. His face went from red to white to a sickly shade of gray. His hand began to shake. "Yes, sir." "No, sir. I don't know what you're talking about. A judge? No, we have a transient. A Jane Doe." He listened again. He looked at the computer screen where Sarah had pulled up Leo Chen's article. It was trending nationwide. Free Judge Sterling was the #1 hashtag on Twitter. I understand," Bronson whispered. He hung up the phone. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Get Dunlap," he croaked to Kyle, who had just walked in with donuts. "Get the chief. Now." Outside, the first news van pulled up. Then a second. Within 20 minutes, the station was surrounded. In Cell 3, Alana Sterling sat in the lotus position. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. Her shoulder was on fire, but her mind was clear water. She heard the commotion outside. She heard the shouting. She heard the panic in Bronson's voice. It has begun. The door to the cell block flew open. Chief Dunlap ran in. He wasn't wearing his fishing vest anymore. He was wearing his uniform, but it looked disheveled, buttoned wrong. He unlocked the cell door. "Miss Sterling," Dunlap said, his voice trembling. "Judge Sterling, there has been a terrible mistake." Alana opened her eyes. She stood up slowly, cradling her injured arm. She looked at Dunlap. "There was no mistake, Chief," she said. Her voice was parched, raspy, but it filled the small space with terrifying authority. "There was a choice, and you made yours." "Please," Dunlap pleaded, holding the door open. "You're free to go. We'll get your car. We'll drop the charges. Just please don't go out there to the cameras." Alana walked past him. She didn't acknowledge him. She walked into the bullpen. Every officer froze. They looked at her, the woman they had laughed at yesterday. Now they saw the truth. They saw the end of their careers walking barefoot across the linoleum. Bronson stood by his desk. He couldn't meet her eyes. He looked at the floor. Alana stopped in front of him. "My watch," she said. Bronson fumbled in the property bag. He handed her the Cartier watch. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "My boots." He gave her the boots. Alana sat on a chair in the middle of the bullpen. She put on her socks. She laced her boots. She strapped on her watch. She stood up. She smoothed her sweater. She fixed her hair. She didn't say a word to them. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She walked to the front door. She pushed it open. The morning sun hit her face. The flashbulbs of 50 cameras erupted like a lightning storm. Reporters shouted her name. "Judge Sterling! Judge Sterling! Were you assaulted? Is it true they denied you counsel?" Alana stopped on the steps. She looked at the cameras. She looked at the terrified face of Chief Dunlap peering through the blinds of the station window. She didn't speak to the press. She simply looked at them, nodded once, and walked toward the black SUV that had just pulled up to the curb. The driver got out. It was a U.S. Marshal. He opened the back door for her. "We'll take it from here, Your Honor," the Marshal said. Alana got in. As the car pulled away, she looked back at the Emerald Lake police station. It looked small. It looked weak. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would be coming back. Not as a prisoner, but as the judge who would burn it to the ground. 2 weeks had passed since the darkness of the holding cell. The world outside Emerald Lake had turned on its axis. But inside the federal district courthouse in Seattle, time seemed to stand still, held in check by the gravity of what was about to happen. This was not a standard criminal arraignment. It was something far rarer and more dangerous for those involved, a special federal inquiry into police misconduct and civil rights violations. Invoked under Title 42 of the U.S. Code, it was a public tribunal designed to strip the veil of immunity from law enforcement agencies suspected of systemic corruption. The courtroom was a cavernous hall of mahogany and marble, designed to make human beings feel small. The air conditioning was set to a meat locker chill, a deliberate tactic to keep tempers cool and nerves frayed. The gallery was packed to capacity. National press correspondents sat in the front rows, their laptops open, fingers poised. Behind them sat the citizens of Emerald Lake, the landscapers, the housekeepers, the cooks who had lived in fear of Bronson's shadow for years. And scattered among them were the wealthy residents, looking uncomfortable and pale, realizing for the first time that their gated community was about to be dissected on live television. At the defense table sat Sergeant Bulldog Bronson and Officer Kyle. Bronson looked uncomfortable in a suit. It was a cheap polyester blend that strained at the shoulders and bunched at the waist. He wasn't wearing his badge or his gun belt, and without them he looked diminished, just a large, red-faced man with a bad haircut and shifting eyes. He kept wiping his palms on his thighs, leaving dark streaks of sweat on the fabric. Officer Kyle looked like he was about to vomit. He was staring at the floor, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. Sitting between them was Mr. Gantry, the police union attorney. Gantry was a man who smelled of expensive aftershave and cynicism. He was whispering to Bronson, his voice low and reassuring. "Relax, Frank. It's a show trial, a circus. They want a headline, that's all. We stick to the script. Qualified immunity. You followed protocol. She was aggressive. We'll be out of here by lunch." "I don't like it," Bronson grumbled, loosening his tie. "Why is the press here? Why is it federal?" "Because she made a fuss," Gantry said dismissively. "But she's just a squatter with a good lawyer. We have the report. We have the chain of custody. The system protects the badge, Frank. Always." Bronson nodded, trying to believe him. He thought about the woman in the cell, the way she had looked at him before she disappeared. "You made a grave error." The memory sent a shiver down his spine, but he shook it off. She was gone. The department had scrubbed the footage. It was his word against hers. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The sound was authoritative, final. Gantry stood up, buttoning his jacket. Bronson hauled himself up, adjusting his bulk. Kyle scrambled to his feet. "The United States District Court for the Western District of Washington is now in session," the bailiff intoned, presiding over the special inquiry into the Emerald Lake Police Department. The heavy oak door behind the bench swung open. The room held its breath. Usually, a door opening is a mundane event, but in this courtroom on this day, it felt like the opening of a tambour, perhaps a silo. A figure emerged from the shadows of the judge's chambers. She was not walking with a limp. She was not holding her arm as if it were injured. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, the heavy black silk of her judicial robes billowing around her like storm clouds. She ascended the steps to the high bench. Every eye in the room was fixed on her. Bronson squinted. The lighting was dramatic, casting her face in shadow for a moment, but as she stepped into the pool of light at the center of the dais, the features became clear. The high cheekbones, the dark, unblemished skin, the eyes that burned with a cold, intellectual fire. It was her. It was the transient. It was the thief. It was the woman he had slammed onto the hood of his car, the woman whose face he had pressed into the dirt, the woman he had spat on. She wasn't standing in the witness box. She wasn't sitting at the plaintiff's table. She was standing behind the Great Seal of the United States. She was holding the gavel. The Honorable Alana Sterling, Senior Circuit Judge of the United States Court of Appeals. The bailiff finished. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was a physical sound, a shockwave of disbelief. Bronson's knees buckled. He actually stumbled, his hand grabbing the edge of the defense table to keep from collapsing. His mouth fell open, his jaw working uselessly. "No," he whispered. "No way. That's her." Gantry, the lawyer, froze. His smug smile evaporated instantly. He looked from Bronson to the bench, his face draining of color. "That's the plaintiff?" he hissed. "You arrested a federal circuit judge?" "I didn't know," Bronson choked out, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. She looked like nobody." On the bench, Alana Sterling did not speak immediately. She arranged her files with slow, deliberate movements. She adjusted her glasses, new ones, replacing the pair Bronson had destroyed. Then she looked down. She looked directly at Bronson. There was no anger in her face. There was no triumphant smirk. There was only a profound, terrifying neutrality. It was the face of a mountain looking at an ant. She picked up the gavel. It was a heavy piece of polished oak. Bang! The sound was like a gunshot in a library. "Be seated," Alana said. Her voice was amplified by the microphone, filling every corner of the room. It was the same voice she had used in her driveway, but now it carried the weight of the federal government. This special inquiry is convened to examine allegations of systemic corruption, civil rights violations, and criminal misconduct within the Emerald Lake Police Department. I am Judge Sterling. Due to the egregious nature of the evidence and the direct attack on the judiciary, I have been granted special dispensation by the Ninth Circuit to preside over the evidentiary phase of these proceedings. She paused, her eyes locking onto Bronson's. Defendant Bronson, Defendant Kyle, you are here to answer for your actions. And you will find that in this courtroom, the badge does not protect you. The truth does. Bronson felt a line of urine leak into his trousers. He couldn't stop it. The terror was absolute. He wasn't facing a lawsuit. He was facing a god he had blasphemed. The inquiry moved with the speed of a guillotine blade. There were no opening statements, no grandstanding. Alana ran her courtroom with surgical precision. "Mr. Gantry," Alana said, looking at the defense lawyer, "your client submitted an incident report regarding the arrest on May 12th. Is this the report?" A clerk handed a document to Gantry. He glanced at it, his hands shaking. "Yes, Your Honor, this is the official police record." "Excellent," Alana said. "Please read the section regarding the suspect's demeanor." Gantry swallowed hard. He stood up, sweat staining his collar. Subject was belligerent, screaming profanities, and exhibited signs of extreme intoxication. Subject resisted arrest and attempted to strike Officer Bronson." "Thank you," Alana said calmly. "So, according to this sworn document, I was screaming and violent." "Yes, Your Honor," Gantry whispered. "Let us examine the veracity of that statement." Alana pressed a button on her console. A massive screen descended behind her. "The Emerald Lake Police Department erased their body camera footage," Alana stated, her voice icy. "A convenient technical error that seems to plague your department whenever a minority is arrested. However," she looked at Bronson, "you forgot about the neighbors. You forgot that in a neighborhood like Emerald Lake, security is paramount. You forgot about the Ring doorbell cameras. And you forgot about the private CCTV system of the estate across the street." The screen flickered to life. The video was high definition. It showed the gravel driveway. It showed Alana standing peacefully with her clipboard. It showed the police cruiser roaring up. The audio was crisp. "You're a squatter, or a thief." Bronson's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, dripping with prejudice. The audience watched in stunned silence. They saw Alana present the permit. They saw Bronson snatch it. "Ripe." The sound of the tearing paper was amplified. It sounded like a bone breaking. "Is this the belligerent suspect, Mr. Bronson?" Alana asked from the bench. She didn't wait for an answer. The video continued. It showed the escalation. It showed Alana standing her ground, calm and collected. And then it showed the moment that made the entire gallery gasp in collective horror. Bronson stepped forward. He hawked, he spat. The gum hit Alana's boot. On the screen, it was disgusting. In the courtroom, it was damning. "Pause," Alana ordered. The image froze on Bronson's face, twisted in a sneer of pure, hateful entitlement. "Officer Bronson," Alana said, "you wrote in your report that I assaulted you. Looking at this frame, who is the aggressor here? Who is the one using biological waste as a weapon?" Bronson stood up. He couldn't help it. "It's taken out of context. She provoked me. She was quoting laws she didn't understand." "I wrote those laws, Sergeant." Alana's voice cracked like a whip, silencing him instantly. "I spent 30 years interpreting the statutes you used as toilet paper. You didn't assault a woman who didn't understand the law. You assaulted the woman who teaches it to the FBI." She hit play again. The slam onto the hood. Clang. The wrenching of the arm. Pop. The crying child. When the video ended, the courtroom was deathly silent. "Perjury," Alana said, ticking it off on her fingers. Falsifying police reports, assault and battery, deprivation of rights under color of law. She leaned forward. But that is just the brutality. Let us discuss the conspiracy. She signaled the clerk. Play Exhibit B. This time there was no video. Just a waveform on the screen. It was a phone call recording. Yeah, Bill. It's done. Just another crazy person from the city. I'm burying her in paper. She won't see sunlight for 72 hours. It was Bronson's voice. Don't worry about the press. I'll leak the mugshot if she fights. And then a second voice, deeper, authoritative, Chief Dunlap. Good work, Bulldog. Keep her in the hole. Make sure she doesn't talk to anyone. If she's still in trouble by Tuesday, we'll transfer her to County Psych. Say she's a Jane Doe. Lose the paperwork. The recording ended. Chief Dunlap, sitting in the front row of the gallery in his dress uniform, turned white. He tried to stand up to leave, but 2 U.S. Marshals stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. Chief Dunlap, Alana said, looking down at him from the bench, that is your voice authorizing the kidnapping and unlawful detention of a federal judge. That is conspiracy to commit a felony. That is obstruction of justice. It was a joke, Dunlap stammered, his authority crumbling like dry sand. We were just blowing off steam. A joke? Alana asked. You call the systematic destruction of a citizen's life a joke? She picked up a stack of files from her desk. They were thick, dusty folders. Let us see how funny your other jokes were. This was the moment the hearing shifted from a personal vindication to a systemic purge. Alana wasn't just interested in Bronson. She was interested in the disease he represented. You thought I was sitting in that cell doing nothing, Alana said to the room. You thought I was crying, but I was listening, I was observing, and when I was released, I went to work. She opened the first file. Marcus Freeman, age 22, arrested by Sergeant Bronson in 2019 for resisting arrest. His nose was broken. His jaw was shattered. He lost his scholarship. He pled guilty to avoid prison because you told him no one would believe a black kid over a cop. She looked at Bronson. Stand up, Mr. Freeman. In the gallery, a young man stood up. His face was scarred, his nose crooked. He looked at Bronson with a mixture of fear and defiance. Sarah Jenkins, Alana read the next name. Single mother, pulled over by Officer Kyle in 2021. You found drugs in her car. Drugs that disappeared from the evidence locker 2 days later. She lost custody of her children. She committed suicide 6 months later. A sobbing woman in the back row held up a photo of Sarah. Case 304, the Garcia family. Their home was raided on a warrant signed by you, Chief Dunlap, based on a tip from a confidential informant that didn't exist. You seized their cash savings, $40,000. That money never made it to the evidence room. It bought you a new boat, didn't it, Chief? Alana read the names. She read them slowly, rhythmically, like a tolling bell. David Ross, Elena Rodriguez, Samuel King. With each name, she held up a file. With each file, she hammered another nail into their coffins. You didn't just hurt me, Alana said, her voice vibrating with suppressed emotion. You built a machine to grind people into dust. You targeted the weak, the poor, the people who couldn't fight back. You treated the law like a weapon to protect your property values and your egos. She looked at Bronson. He was weeping now. Not out of remorse, but out of the sheer crushing weight of the exposure. He was being flayed alive in public. You called me a rat, Alana said to him. You said I was a mouse in your garden. She stood up, her black robes flaring. She looked 10 feet tall. I am not a mouse, Sergeant Bronson. I am the exterminator. She turned to Officer Kyle. He was shaking, tears streaming down his face. Officer Kyle, Alana said softly, you covered your camera? You wrote the false report? Why? I was scared, Kyle sobbed. I was scared of him. He pointed at Bronson. He said we stick together. He said it's us against them. And that, Alana said, looking out at the cameras, is the lie that rots the badge. There is no us against them. There is only the law, and those who break it. She closed the final file. The stack was a foot high, a monument to their sins. This court has heard enough, Alana said. The evidence is overwhelming, the testimony is damning, and the silence of this town, she looked at the wealthy residents of Emerald Lake, is complicity. She raised the gavel. This hearing is concluded, but justice is just beginning. Bang. The fallout was nuclear. The federal inquiry didn't just result in a report, it resulted in indictments. Sergeant Bulldog Bronson stood for sentencing 3 months later. He was stripped of his pension, his assets seized to pay restitution to his victims. He was charged with federal civil rights violations, kidnapping, and assault on a federal officer. The Judea colleague of Alana's showed no mercy. Bronson was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. As he was led away, shackled and broken, he looked back at the gallery. There were no friendly faces, only the people he had hurt watching him with dry eyes. He had become the trash he so despised. Officer Kyle was fired and charged with conspiracy and perjury. Because of his testimony against Bronson and Dunlap, he received a reduced sentence, 3 years of probation and a permanent ban from law enforcement. He left the courtroom weeping, a young man whose life was ruined because he didn't have the courage to say no. Chief Dunlap fared the worst. The forensic accountants found the money. They found the bribes, the theft, the laundering. He was charged under the RICO Act. He would die in prison. The Emerald Lake Police Department was dissolved. The state took over jurisdiction. The entire force was fired and required to reapply under strict federal oversight. The clubhouse was shuttered. But the true victory was for Alana. 6 months later, the construction on the Blackwood estate was finished. The mansion was restored to its former glory, the paint fresh and white, the porch sturdy. But the most important change was the fence. Alana hadn't built a high wall to keep people out. She had built a low, beautiful wrought iron fence with a wide gate that stood open. It was a Sunday afternoon. The air was crisp and smelled of pine. Alana sat on her porch swing, holding a cup of tea. Her shoulder still ached when it rained, a permanent reminder of the price she had paid, but she could move it. She wasn't wearing her robes. She was wearing jeans and a sweater. A car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a police car. It was a news van. Leo Chen, the journalist who had broken the story, stepped out. He walked up the driveway, smiling. "Justice Sterling?" he called out. "Enjoying the peace?" "I am, Leo," Alana smiled. "And please, call me Alana." "The town is changing," Leo said, leaning against the porch railing. "The new oversight committee is tough. The residents are waking up. It's not perfect, but the fear is gone." "That's all we can ask for," Alana said. Just then, movement caught her eye. The little boy from next door, the one who had cried when Bronson attacked her, was standing at the edge of the fence. He was holding something behind his back. Alana waved him over. "It's okay, Timmy. Come on in." The boy walked up the steps shyly. He revealed what he was hiding. It was a bouquet of wildflowers, picked from the edge of the forest, clumsily tied with a piece of yarn. "For you," he whispered. "I'm glad you're safe." Alana took the flowers. She smelled them. They smelled like wild earth and freedom. "Thank you, Timmy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you going to stay?" the boy asked. "My dad said, he said you're a hero. He said you cleaned up the monsters." Alana looked out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the deep green of the trees. The silence of Emerald Lake was no longer heavy. It was light. It was the silence of a place that had nothing to hide. "Yes, Timmy," Alana said, smiling at the boy. "I'm staying. This is my home. And monsters aren't allowed here anymore." The story of Alana Sterling and the town of Emerald Lake is a testament to the enduring power of dignity in the face of brute force. Bronson and Dunlap believed that power was something you wore on your chest, a badge, a gun, a title. They believed that authority gave them the right to define reality, to decide who belonged and who didn't. They mistook silence for weakness and civility for submission. But Alana proved that true power is internal. It is the unshakable knowledge of one's rights and the courage to defend them, not with fists but with the truth. She showed that the law is not a tool for the powerful to oppress the weak, but a shield for the innocent and a sword against the corrupt. Justice is not a gift that is given. It is a fortress that must be defended. And sometimes the most powerful verdict is not spoken in a courtroom, but in the quiet, defiant act of simply existing in a space that tried to erase you.